I understand the statistics overall in Africa of churches being destroyed, of Christians being butchered. They're staggering. Can you fill us on the latest numbers?
Going down, let's say, sub-Saharan Africa, this is a nightmare. In Nigeria, where you have a bona fide genocide, just between January and April of this year, you had 1,500 Christians were hacked to death. Now, how many people in the West even heard of that? They heard that about 248 Palestinians were killed.
Praise be Jesus Christ. This is Father Robert McTigg of the Society of Jesus, your daily host for the Catholic Current, where we bring Christ to the world and the world to Christ. You're listening to us from the Station of the Cross Studios, your local radio station, and the iCatholic Radio mobile app, where we proclaim the fullness of truth with clarity and charity. As always, let's start with prayer. In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Almighty God, through the intercession of St. Ignatius Loyola, we ask that you pour forth your Holy Spirit upon us, a spirit of discernment, that may hear your voice and obey your command. And may God bless Schmiggy, who is celebrating a birthday today. In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Well, friends, it's Timely Tuesday. Our lively guest and I look at hot headlines affecting the church and the world. We always like to go to our A-list on Tuesdays, so people who can do jazz duets with me, commenting on what's taking place within us and around us. My returning guest is one of our favorite guests. We always get wildly good feedback when she appears on the show. You know her as the Crusader Girl, Sarah Corriher. Welcome back to the Catholic Current.
Thank you so much for having me. It's always a pleasure.
Sarah, we've talked about cancel culture on and off the air, and I had a very brief experience with cancel culture, and it was you who brought that to my attention. Could you tell us about that, please?
Sure. I actually went to recommend one of your books to a friend of mine. And before doing so, I was going to send a quick link over to Amazon. And so I went by Amazon, like a lot of people do, because it's the main seller of books, for better or for worse, I think mostly for worse, and searched for your name, and it wasn't there. Your books didn't show up, none of them. And so then I thought, well, maybe there's something wrong with that. And so I searched directly for the title of your book, and your book didn't come up then either. And this was shortly after your appearance on Newsmax, when you had simply been disappeared, it might be said,
right.
Which was a little shocking to me, because I'm used to people disappearing if they talk about things like alternative health or if they talk about things like politics, but not so much if they, frankly, strictly stick to Christian topics, which is pretty much what you do. So right. It was kind of like moving the line further, you might say.
Right. It was kind of a shift of the Overton window. That Friday, I had a brief appearance on the Chris Salcedo show on Newsmax. I was surprised to find myself on the screen with Alan Dershowitz, and we were talking about attacks on Christian ethics and Christian culture. It was very brief. I thought it was pretty mild. I tend to be pretty sober on the air. And then it was just gone for 24 hours. And I found that if you did a search of my name or my title, you could find the Amazon link in there. But then if you went to my author page, I was gone. I mean, my photo was there, my bio was there, and but none of my work was there. Now, fortunately, it was only 24 hours. And I talked to some other friends in media, and they said, oh, yeah, that's kind of what happens when you appear on Newsmax automatically. You get grabbed by some algorithm.
Well,
so
I will add, if I may, that it was worse than most people might think, because, like you said, you could find the actual link if you went to a search engine, then you click through to the actual book page. And when you were actually at the right book page, the author is actually a link to an author page. Well, when you clicked on that at the time, the website address or the URL said strip books. It's actually Amazon/strip books. Kind of, proving the point that your books have been, stripped. Right. That
an algorithm was at work, but the algorithm was working because somebody had made a decision. And I'm happy to announce, friends, that when I related this to a friend of mine, he was indignant on my behalf, and he decided to fight the power. So he ordered 15 copies of my book, Real Philosophy for Real People, from Ignatius Press, and sent it here to the studio in Buffalo. So if you are among the first 15, send an email to info@thestationofthecross.com. That's info@thestationofthecross.com. Give us your name and how you want the dedication set, and I will autograph the books and send it to you. So that's info@thestationofthecross.com. Ask for that book, and I'm very grateful for my generous benefactor. Sarah, you and I did a video, it was about a month or so ago, and after we concluded it, we said, wow, this will get you canned on YouTube. I might have used a more colorful word at the time, but this and when we made a decision to have it for kind of a workaround with YouTube. Would you tell people about that, please?
Yeah, well, what we ended up having to do, because we talked about, the new fad of transgenderism and how it's being promoted and even forced upon doctors. They're not allowed to make their own medical decisions anymore. They have to kind of defer to the Biden administration. Well, after talking about that for an hour, it was clear that we couldn't put it on YouTube, so we ended up having to put essentially a trailer on YouTube saying, hey, there's something that we can't talk about. There's something that's too honest for YouTube. Hey, come look at this at any of the other sites on which, I do actually speak freely, whether that's Odyssey or Gab TV or BitChute or, Rumble, any of them. So that's what we ended up having to do. And it's kind of sad that we've reached a point where you can't give what I consider to be pretty normal opinions. I mean, I don't think this is beyond the pale to say that, that the transgender thing, if you went back 20 years and said what's going on now to somebody, they would think you were absolutely insane.
Right.
And yet, we have very quickly reached a point in time where you're not allowed to say any of this, where you can't simply say, a man is a man, and that not be considered this new fad of hate speech.
Right. Friends, on this timely Tuesday, my returning guest is Sarah Corriher, known as the Crusader Gal. We'll be linking to her website in the show notes. I want to talk about language. We're going to talk about more in the next segment, but I'll say this much. I sometimes when public speaking, I make a little joke. I say, I'm from a mixed marriage. My mother was a woman and my father was a man. And people laugh somewhat nervously. And I said, 5 years ago, that joke would have been unintelligible. 5 years hence, it might really be hate speech or a thought crime as well. And I think the idea that the powers and principalities of this world are lining up to say there are some topics, there are some words, there are some things which cannot be thought, said, heard, or else. And sometimes, as James Corbett said, it's the burning of the library at Alexandria, but sometimes it's just hiding the index, the table of contents to the library. Now, on your channel, on YouTube, I've had a lot of friends say, why doesn't Sarah have more followers on YouTube? Why isn't she better known? Her work is so solid. Do you suspect that maybe YouTube and other players are throttling back on your work?
This morning, I woke up to many emails, but among them were 2 from YouTube notifying me of new comments, both of which said, I've been unsubscribed from you. Not I unsubscribed, but I've been unsubscribed. In other words, against their will. And that happens a lot. People get unsubscribed against their will. It's, you were talking about algorithms earlier. Certain people who speak actual truth, including myself, have people unsubscribed from them against their will. Companies like YouTube decide that other people who have themselves decided that they want to hear from me, because that's what they're doing when they subscribe, that they simply don't have the ability to do so. And it's multifaceted, actually, because yes, it prevents the listener from getting access to me in a very tangible sense. But more than that, it's about psychological games. It's about playing games with the people who produce videos, for example, because the people who produce those videos then wonder, well, maybe I'm not reaching people. Maybe my opinions simply aren't of value. And it's this psychological game wherein YouTube is actually playing this game with the creator to try and prevent them from continuing, to try and dull their spirit, make them decide, you know what, I should just stop, or I should change, I should do something else, maybe I should go a little bit further left, and so on. I'm familiar with a YouTube creator, in fact, who did this very thing. He was very conservative, spoke out on, pretty Christian principles, or as he saw them, conservative principles, but actually, in actual fact, they're one and the same. Over time, he started realizing, I do a lot better in the algorithms if I just aren't that conservative. And nowadays, he talks about how conservatism should be more progressive. And I'm not joking, that's actually something that he says. And, I get it. He basically sold out for popularity. He was never a friend of mine, but he's someone that I'm familiar with. And I do think that's intentional on the part of YouTube. They're trying to actually create that action amongst people who produce at the same time as making people who watch feel alienated and alone as well.
Right. I think one of the reasons why some people get started in YouTube is because they say, I think I have something that needs to be said, and then the audience says, "Oh my gosh, I'm not alone. I thought it was only me who had this not typical opinion." And then you find out over time a community forms, and you say, hey, things that are traditional values, conservative values, which I agree tend to be Christian values rooted in natural law and revelation, because God really knew what he was doing when he decided to make people and then to save them from themselves. And I think it would be really good for us to read the manual and act accordingly. And I think that's a threat to the emerging paradigm of, we're going to erase human nature and impose our will upon it. And one of the ways you need to do that, it's really time consuming and costly and ugly to drag people out of their beds in the middle of the night and ship them on a train to Siberia. But if you don't have to fight that fight at all by just dialing down on someone's volume, discouraging them, letting them believe that their work is never heard and doesn't matter, that's pernicious, and especially because there is not an opportunity to fight back. Friends, when we come back on this Timely Tuesday, I'll continue my conversation with Sarah Corriher, known as the Crusader Gal. We'll link to her website. And remember that I have 15 copies of my book available if you send in a request at info@thestationofthecross.com. Remember, our rallying cry here at the Catholic Current is Christus Mundo, Mundus Christo, bringing Christ to the world and the world to Christ. We do it because our Lord says so, for the greater glory of God, the love of our neighbor, and the salvation of our own soul. After the broadcast today, go to stationofthecross.com, get our resources list, download our audio as podcast. In the next segment, we're going to talk about cracks in our culture. You don't want to miss it. We'll be right back. Stay with us.
There's no better way to start your day than with spiritual formation from inspiring priests.
Patriotism is a virtue that was allied to the old virtue of the Greeks and Latin called pietas. Pietas meant love of God, love of neighbor, love of country. And when one goes out, all go out.
That's Sermons for Everyday Living, weekdays from 6 to 7 a.m. Eastern on the Station of the Cross.
You're listening to The Catholic Current with Father Robert Mateg from the Station of the Cross Catholic Media Network. Stay connected with the show, our guests and topics, by following the show on Twitter and Gab. Just search for The Catholic Current.
Praise be Jesus Christ. This is Father Robert Mateg of the Society of Jesus, your daily host for the Catholic Current, where we bring Christ to the world and the world to Christ. You're listening to us from the Station of the Cross Studios, your local radio station, and the iCatholic Radio mobile app, where we proclaim the fullness of truth with clarity and charity. It's Timely Tuesday here at the Catholic Current. My returning guest is the Crusader Gal, Sarah Corriher. A couple of specials on this Tuesday. I was shadow banned for a bit on Amazon. In response, we're making 15 copies of my book, Real Philosophy for Real People, available. So if you are among the first 15, send an email to info@thestationofthecross.com. Usually in Timely Tuesdays, the last segment is you and me sharing timely thoughts on what we heard today. We're certainly going to have that. But as a bonus, after the broadcast, go to our podcast site. Sarah and I are going to continue the conversation without commercial break, because we're just getting started, and then we have to pull the plug, but not this Tuesday. Sarah, I want to talk about cracks in our culture. I'm beginning to suspect that, maybe the lunatics are running the asylum. There's a tweet out from the White House this weekend that is not only celebrating Pride Month, but gives a shout out to all transgendered people, especially our brave youth, that the president has your back now and always. I know what it means to be brave physically and morally. Why are we talking about young people with gender dysphoria being brave? Are they being brave in terms of patiently waiting for them to come to clarity with good medical and psychological help, or is the White House meaning brave in a different sense?
Well, I think that the White House is encouraging a type of mental illness, what you might say is a type of mass hysteria. On a societal level, what we're doing right now is encouraging kids to adopt this mantra of being trans or of being anything other than heterosexual. And you see that manifest in so-called Pride Month, in which we're now in, if you acknowledge, the cultural norm now. Every major company has, the rainbow flag colors to represent homosexuality and transgenderism and all this other stuff, except for their Middle Eastern counterparts, in which case, the Middle Eastern BMW doesn't have the rainbow flag, of course, but they do here in the United States. But as we are in this kind of sector, you might say, in Pride Month, you can really see all the different forces upon our youth telling them, you'll be extra cool if you're trans. You'll be extra accepted. You'll be extra brave if you accept and say, you know what, I'm something other than the norm. I deviate in some way. And that's what we're encouraging. And as we do that, you can expect more and more youths to say, yeah, that's me. Because youths want to be cool, they want to be accepted, they want to be liked, all of these things. Mm-hmm. And, it ends up becoming a vice. But as we encourage something like transgenderism, if we're going to indulge the term, you're talking about taking these kids then, which say, yes, make me cool, I am this other gender, and then giving them hormone blockers to destroy their lives, giving them life-altering or life-destroying surgeries, all under this guise of it's all under perversion. And our supposed betters, our supposed elitists in government and throughout the media, throughout basically every force, you've got the entertainment industry, you've got the educational industry, and you've got the political class all together mounting enormous pressure amongst our youth. And, we're in this terrible situation where there's a lot for them to resist at this point.
Right. Part of adolescence is wanting to belong, wanting to fit in, wanting to be invited to sit at the cool kids table. And there was a time where if you wanted to be cool or liked or approved of, you got a haircut, or you bought an expensive jacket or a pair of sneakers, you got your ear pierced or something else pierced, or you smoked cigarettes or something like that, or got a tattoo. They've really, really upped the ante. And, I pay very close attention to language. One of my favorite little books is by Joseph Pieper. He talks about abusive language and abusive power. And I'm seeing that more and more in the federal government. There's a federal, part of the federal budget, they talk about maternity care, and they use the word maternity, they use the word maternal, but they don't use the word mother. Instead, they use the word birthing person. What do you think's going on here?
Well, as they remove motherhood as part of, the female, it's twisted because when we don't have language, we can't communicate, right? And as they redefine the basic words that we use, because of course you have to be female, you have to be a woman in order to give birth. As we redefine these words, we lose our ability to communicate the most basic of truths. Right. And that's what we're starting to see. And that's why I find it particularly alarming because, you can make the references to the Soviet Union and you can do so well, where language was redefined over there. Pravda was their magazine or their newspaper, which meant truth, and it was full of lies. And it's really easy to make those parallels, but it's frightening to say that we are in a society now where we're redefining things to such a degree that we can't acknowledge that even a woman gives birth, right? That a mother is the one who's giving birth. I think it's tragic and dangerous.
And this is sad to say. This is really not a new thing. I remember exchange on the Senate. It was Dianne Feinstein of California, and I'm blanking on the name of the senator from Pennsylvania. And the question was, when does a woman become a mother? And, said if the baby emerges from the womb, that's prima facie evidence that this woman is a mother. And Dianne Feinstein was insisted that the woman is not a mother unless she bonds with the child, and that the child doesn't have rights until the woman becomes a mother by taking the child in her arms. And I said this was madness, and this was over 20 years ago. Confucius said that the beginning of wisdom is calling things by their proper names. If you can't call things by their proper names, then absolutely everything is at risk, including things like truth and falsehood, and good and evil. Now, Sarah, you know I'm a dark, brooding, melancholic Irishman with an apocalyptic imagination, and I can come up with the worst possible interpretation of this manipulation of language, which they happen to be doing badly, by the way. I mean, if you want to excise women from the federal budget by calling them birth and persons, you're at pains to explain why maternal and maternity are part of the conversation. But here's what I'm asking you, Sarah. Are people just being foolish and this has gotten out of control? This is like the Sorcerer's Apprentice? Or do you think that there is a wider, deeper plan, scheme, end game in mind, that what we're seeing is not just a lot of people doing foolish things for a very long time, but a pattern that's leading somewhere? Where do you fall on that spectrum?
I don't think it's accidental, which would be the alternative implication. I don't think that's true at all. Mm-hmm. I think that what we're seeing is the redefining of basic truth and the devaluing of life. And that's really where we are, where we're devaluing the human spirit. We're renaming women. We're essentially erasing women in a very tangible sense, mm-hmm. which, is kind of amusing when you think of what the left has been doing beforehand. Right. When they're supposedly talking about empowerment and so on. And now they basically are ignoring that women are any different or indistinguishable from men. Right. Because if a man can be a woman, then there is no difference between men and women, of course. But as you give essentially the government the ability to redefine words on a whim, you also give them the ability to redefine laws on whim too. And, in that hour-long interview that I did with you, where we talked about transgenderism, a big part of that was the discussion as to how the Biden administration has essentially rewritten the Civil Rights Act on a whim by defining sex as whatever the person wants. So now sex discrimination doesn't make as much sense because there are no men and there are no women, according to the Biden administration, because one can simply be the other. And this is being used, of course, to put, men inside of women's bathrooms, in college dorms, and that kind of thing. So that's just one indication of where we're going.
Right. Friends, I'm in conversation with Sarah Corriher, the Crusader Gal, on this timely Tuesday. We'll be linking to sarahcorriher.com in the show notes. You should know, too, that I was temporarily shadow banned at Amazon.com. In response, we're making 15 copies of my book, Real Philosophy for Real People, available. Go to info@thestationofthecross.com to request your free copy. You'll want to stay with us for the whole hour and beyond. In the last segment, I'll offer my closing monologue, Timely Thoughts. And then on our podcast platform, Sarah and I will continue the conversation without interruption. Sarah, I think that this is an especially cruel situation for children. To say, a 3-year-old, if you ask them if you're a boy or a girl, all they have to do is look down, and they have confidence in their senses, and they have confidence in the obvious, and they have confidence that when they point to a dog, it's a dog. When they point to a cat, it's a cat. If everything is up for grabs, then you are quite literally disoriented. You have no place, sense of purpose, or identity. Doesn't that open the doors to propaganda? You're just raw material. You're silly putty, but Uncle Sam is here to tell you the truth of who you really are. Is that the kind of dystopia that we're tending towards?
Yeah, absolutely. And when you tell a child when you confuse a child intentionally about this part of themselves, you have to remember that being a boy or being a girl is a pretty intrinsic part of who that child is. It's a part in which they take pride. I'm a girl, you're yucky because you're a boy. That's actually, a big part of their sense of identity at an age in which they have very little to cling to. Mm-hmm. When you start saying something to a child like that, intentionally confusing them about who they are at an age where they really don't know who they are, it leaves a person, well, without that grounding, I guess you could say, and without a sense of grounding, a person is much more easy to be manipulated, to be misled. Right. And that is what we're seeing. Essentially, the government, and in many ways a sense of academia too, which, kind of trickles down to government, are creating this mantra that allows the renaming of things to such a degree that nobody knows who they are, what their purpose is, and nobody's even free to talk about how they feel, what's down when they look down. Nothing. Mm-hmm. It's like when reality itself is in question, we're going to live in madness.
So I want to talk briefly about the role of parents in all this. I was talking to a parent recently, and I said, "So what are you up to?" And she said, "Well, I'm filling out the opt-out form for my kids so they don't have to participate in the HIV AIDS prevention program in their school. And these children are 11 and 13." And I said, "Oh, and have they been exposed to the gender unicorn yet?" And she said, "Oh, over my dead body." What kind of vigilance is now required of parents? I think it's a different kind than when I was growing up.
Yes, in fact, it seems like there aren't many good choices for parents unless they're going to homeschool. Because the schools, some private schools and all public schools, have decided that it is not just their right, but somehow their duty to corrupt minors, which used to be a crime, but nowadays seems not to be. But instead, just to confuse them about their identity, to try and tell them that, you're probably not heterosexual. You're probably one of these other things. Because there are so many other things. So why would you be one of the normal? Because they actually essentially minimize the likelihood of a person being normal by saying, there are like 500 genders. So what's the chance that you're a cis, i.e. a normal person who identifies with the way that you look when, as you said, when you look down? So that they keep using this phrase like it's the new normal. The new normal is not that you would be, a normal straight person, of course. It would be that you'd be something else, something cool. That's what we're seeing in schools.
Right. Friends, when we come back, we're going to continue our conversation with Sarah Corriher on this Timely Tuesday. In the next segment, we're going to be talking about updates on COVID culture. After the broadcast today, go to thestationofthecross.com, get our resources list, download our audio as podcast. Special treat in this podcast, Sarah and I will continue the conversation without commercial interruption. We'll be back in just 2 minutes. Please do stay with us.
This is the Catholic Current from the Station of the Cross Catholic Media Network. Catch up on an episode you've missed or share them with your family or friends. The Catholic Current is podcasted wherever you enjoy listening. Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, Stitcher, TuneIn, and the iCatholic Radio mobile app.
Praise be Jesus Christ. This is Father Robert McTigg of the Society of Jesus, your daily host for the Catholic Current, where we bring Christ to the world and the world to Christ. You're listening to us from the Station of the Cross Studios, your local radio station, and the iCatholic Radio mobile app, where we proclaim the fullness of truth with clarity and charity. It's a very special, timely Tuesday here at the Catholic Current. My returning guest is Sarah Corriher. You know her as the Crusader Gal. Want to let you know that as we talk about cancel culture today, I was shadow banned briefly on Amazon. In response, we're offering 15 copies of my book, Real Philosophy for Real People. You can ask for an autographed copy by sending us an email at info@thestationofthecross.com. The next segment, if you're listening to us live, will be my usual closing monologue, Timely Thoughts. If you're listening to us on podcast, you're going to hear an extended conversation. Sarah and I will be talking after this break, and we'll be talking without commercial interruption. Sarah, we would be remiss if we had a Timely Tuesday and we didn't talk about COVID, the updates on COVID culture. COVID seems to be the COVID interruption seems to be changing a little bit. I think people are getting exasperated. People are getting frustrated. And not surprisingly, the powers that be are cracking down. Even in California, where science says we can start living like normal human beings as of June 15th, Governor Newsom says, well, sure, you can live normally, but I'm still retaining my special powers. You had a startling interview a little while ago with Pastor Artur Pawlowski, who was savagely brutalized and terrorized by Canadian authorities. Fill us on what happened there, please.
Yes, certainly. So Pastor Arthur Pawlowski is a Canadian pastor who has been harassed, basically, throughout this whole COVID saga, and has received tons of different fines and so on, the police showing up in the middle of the night to harass. And then finally, they arrested him as he was traveling away from a church service. And they arrested him in the middle of a highway, had him down, on his knees, and they carried him to the vehicle. And then when he was in the vehicle, he was put in a position where he was in constant pain. They tortured him. They sleep deprived him. He wasn't able to sleep in the cell, not just because it was incredibly uncomfortable because he had no bed, but also because they wouldn't dim the lights like they did for everybody else. They mocked his faith whilst he was there. And then they refused, the prison guards actually refused to release him when a judge said that he should be released. They delayed and said that, his brother, who had also been arrested, also for no reason other than holding a church service, they said that his brother's name had been spelt wrong on the court documents, which it had not. And they used this as an excuse, a justification to continue holding these two men for 2 hours. But it's a constant fight with the government that he's dealing with the leader of his particular province actually saying that we're going to destroy the Pavlovskis. It's an actual vendetta against them for being Christian and for acting in a Christian way. But what I mean by that is by acting as if the church matters more than government, which is all he did. He acted as if I'm going to stay open and keep feeding the poor and keep preaching to people despite the COVID saga. I'm going to keep doing what I've been called to do, basically. And because of that, he's made some powerful enemies.
I always thought of Canadians as pretty mild-mannered people. Certainly the ones that I had met, and yet not so much. You did another video where Canada is making handshaking criminal. Tell us about that, please.
Yeah. So over there, I saw this video the first time and I thought, this can't be real. But in fact it was, because you had a police officer who was giving somebody a fine for shaking somebody else's hand, who wanted to shake their hand. Okay, so you got two people gathered together and they shake hands in public. It's a standard greeting and has been throughout the West for some time. A police officer saw this and decided to issue a fine and essentially a criminal penalty for this. And, it's just shocking to me that A, that would actually be considered to be criminal, but B, that an officer would actually try and enforce it. And right. I've become really exasperated over the last 50 months or so at how many police officers are willing to enforce any rules seemingly without limit, and then offset the responsibility onto others. And it worries me because when you look at different tyrannical places in the past, well, that's what you saw. That was always the defense, was I'm just doing my job. I'm just doing what I've been told to do. Whether you look at
orders.
Right, just following orders. Whether you look at, the Nuremberg example there, or whether you look at the Soviet example, it doesn't really matter. And honestly, I think that part of the problem is that we have over-dehumanized the tyrants of the past. If you'll allow me to indulge that for a second.
Sure, please.
I was raised, I was never taught about the Soviet Union until after I left high school, but we learned about the Nazis amply. And one of the questions that a lot of teachers ask the kids is, well, would you have been a Nazi? And of course, everybody says no. And Nazis were dehumanized to such a degree that we don't consider them to be human. And that's a problem, because it means that we can't ever see ourselves in that position. We can never see ourselves as being capable of doing the evil that we have seen other people do throughout history. And as long as we don't think that we are capable of that, we're not on guard for that. We're not on guard for ourselves actually being led or misled into a position of evil. And that needs to change. I think people should be told, you know what, maybe you would. Maybe if the right person told you to do the wrong thing, maybe you would, because the herd mentality is, sadly enough, part of the human psyche, and it takes work, and it's hard to resist that. And if maybe we had been raised like that, instead of just dehumanizing the tyrants of the past as, well, they were obviously monsters who didn't have families and they were just kind of almost cartoonish in their evil. Maybe we'd have done a little bit better during this era.
Sir, I'm glad you mentioned that up, and three thoughts come to mind immediately. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who saw Soviet evil up close, said we like to think of evil as some distant thing out there that someone should go out and kill. And he said, but the fault line between good and evil runs through every human heart. And if you doubt that, we should read more Dostoevsky, if I make a pitch for reading fiction for busy people. Also, I'm aware of the fact that I taught on the problem of evil for many years. I taught medical ethics for many years, and I've done segments on Nazi doctors. And how is it that people who had families, who went to church, and who took the Hippocratic Oath engaged in such gruesome activities? And it would be easy to say, well, they weren't really human, or the devil just absolutely usurped them. And that's not right. The people who've studied this very closely said there's a phenomenon called doubling. And in fact, you split yourself out. So, you have breakfast with your family, you kiss your wife and kids goodbye, you go to the death camp, you torture people all day, and then you come home and you celebrate your child's birthday with balloons and cake. And what you do is you split yourself off, that there's the husband and father at home who's cheery and jovial, and then there's the monster who dissects other people's children while they're alive. And I think we can begin to split that off. If I have breakfast with my wife and kids. I put on a badge and a gun. I'm here to protect and serve. And if they say kick down the doors of a church, then that's what I'm going to do. And I was thinking to myself, if I were en masse, if I were preaching, and someone in authority said, you have to stop that because reasons, what would I do? And I really hope I would have the courage and integrity to say, do you feel proud of what you're doing? Are you looking forward to looking into the eyes of your children this evening and telling them what you did? And I hope I'm not kidding myself. Number one, I'd have the guts to do it. And number two, that it might have some effect. But I think one of the tragic consequences of the COVID interruption is that it's revealed a lot about human weakness. And I think it's diminished people's ability to trust in armed, badged authority because they were enforcing, apparently without hesitation, draconian and arbitrary rules that were manifestly unjust and unconstitutional. Do you think I'm in the zone with that, or have I missed the mark?
I think you are in the zone, and I think that what we actually see is a manifest kind of abuse of the inherent appeal to authority that is in every man. Mm-hmm. For example, we've talked before about how human beings yearn for God. It's part of our nature, right? Yes. We intrinsically seek it, and that's why in secular societies they begin to see government as God. And when you see people deferring to authority, like what we've seen, I think that's what you're seeing. You're seeing people defer to an authority that is illegitimate, whether it be the police chief or the governor or whoever who's saying, these churches can't worship. It's because our society increasingly doesn't see God as the ultimate authority, and because of that, we're willing to do almost anything for the authority that we do see.
Right. It was Dostoevsky who said, if there is no God, then everything is permissible. People think that if you dispense with God, you get rid of the great transcosmic buzzkill and we'll all live happily ever after. No, but to quote the poet, welcome to the jungle. And what will prevail is not truth or reason or discernment or freedom or liberty, but the power of the stronger against the weaker, especially the power of the mob. And I know enough about human history that a mob is a terrible thing, and it's very, very easily manipulated. And we've got mobs being formed and injected with nonsense on a scale that was unimaginable. Even, back when I was a young man washing the ink from reading newspapers all afternoon on a Saturday, we're dealing with very great powers. Sir, what are your thoughts about ordinary people resisting the propaganda and resisting the abuse? How does that happen?
Well, I think it happens when people realize what's going on. And that's why you have so many different, social media companies, for example. It's why you have the government clamping down on alternative speech, on creators, you might say, on people who produce videos or podcasts, audio shows, and so on, who are trying to put pressure on to prevent alternative ideas from getting out there. Because it requires that people realize that they're not entirely alone. Mm-hmm. That there are others who think as they do. There are others who value, for example, freedom. When you isolate people completely and make them feel like they're the only people in the world who care about their own ideals, their own principles, real principles, mm-hmm. then they're much less likely to speak out. Right. They're much more likely to just kind of accept, our world is dark and fallen, and there's just nothing I can do about it. I might as well just indulge because I don't want to be alone. And so that's why there's such a concerted effort. And I think that we should kind of find some sense of peace in the fact that the censorship that's going on, I guess as you called it, the cancel culture that's going on, is actually indicative of something else. It's indicative of the fact that there are lots of people who feel as we do. They're simply not being given the voice that they should have.
Right. And I think part of what I'm doing in my work, and I know that you're doing with yours, is to let thoughtful, honest people who know that something is wrong, that they are not alone. I mean, solitude is a very fine thing. Loneliness is a painful thing. Isolation is a dangerous thing, a very, very dangerous thing. And to say that, hey, friend, you're going to be cut off from polite society. You'll be shunned, you'll be scorned, but there is a way that you can belong. There is a way that you can become one of us. That's what I find really dangerous, and why I think you should continue in your work, and with the help of my friends at the Station of the Cross, I want to continue in mine. Sarah, we've got just a minute left in this segment. Do you have a word of encouragement to offer to the listeners?
Well, that was my main encouragement, actually, was the fact that you're not as alone as you think you are. And in fact, the reason that they're silencing the voices of people like us is because our ideas would win on a level playing field.
Right.
What we're talking about would actually propel to the top in a level playing field. And so these people have decided that the best solution is instead to simply remove the level playing field and to prevent us from having that voice and from speaking the truth. So in light of that, remember that basically the only way that the other side wins is in our silence. Therefore, you have power in speaking up.
No, I agree. There's a wrong kind of silence when we're being victimized, and then we remain silent. It can be fear, it can be confusion, it can be shame. But you're not alone, and God will give you the grace to do the right thing. And I ask all of our listeners to meditate on that. Friends, if you're listening to us live in the next segment, it's you and me sharing timely thoughts on what we heard. If you're listening to us on our podcast platform, definitely want to stay with us, because Sarah and I will continue the conversation in kind of an after party without commercial break. Follow what we're following by following us on Gab. That's gab.com. Our channel is called The Catholic Current. Everything you need to keep the conversation going among your family and friends, we give to you together. Let's take it around the world. We'll be back in just 2 minutes. Please do stay with us.
You're listening to The Catholic Current with Father Robert Matej from the Station of the Cross Catholic Media Network. Stay connected with the show, our guests and topics, by following the show on Twitter and Gab. Just search for The Catholic Current.
Praise be Jesus Christ. This is Father Robert Matej of the Society of Jesus, your daily host for the Catholic Current, where we bring Christ to the world and the world to Christ. You're listening to us on the Station of the Cross Studios, your local radio station, and the iCatholic Radio mobile app, where we proclaim the fullness of truth with clarity and charity. You are seeing a premier approach to Timely Tuesday here at the Catholic Current. We find that commercial breaks can often interrupt a really terrific conversation. So in the podcast version of Timely Tuesdays, when a guest is amenable, we're going to continue the conversation, kind of an after party. And then in the next segment will be my usual closing monologue called Timely Thoughts. I'm speaking with Sarah Corriher. You know her as the Crusader Gal. Sarah, we've been talking about confronting cancel culture, and I had a little bit of an experience of that myself. I started to get some emails this morning. Friends are seeing that I recorded a talk for an online conference that's being sponsored by the Lepanto Institute, asking the question, are we living in the time of the great apostasy? I've given a talk on higher education, which somehow got the title of Revolution in the Church. But here's what surprised me. Friends were emailing me from different sources that, hey, Father, the conference that hasn't premiered yet is being denounced by people who would identify as Orthodox or traditional or conservative Catholicism, saying, well, there's no reason to listen to that because we know what those people are like, and if you think this is a hot topic, well, then we already know what you're like. So there seemed to be don't even bother. You know how those people are. Anyone who's interested in a topic like this might be bad. And I said, they haven't listened to any of my talks or any of the other speakers, and at least my take in talking about the great apostasy is, I don't know, but probably not, but here are some things to be concerned about. So here's my question for you. You've been doing the media thing much longer than I have. It seems that sometimes people who should be your friends, sympathetic, or at least cheerfully indifferent, get upset if you talk about certain types of topics or have conversations with people that they don't like. Have you had that a similar experience?
With friends in media, it's a tough ball, to be honest with you. Mm-hmm. There are lots of different, I hate to be cold, but lots of different narcissists in media who do what they do because they want the fame or because they want the money more than they actually care about what it is that they say. And then I found that to be something that's kind of dark, and it was unexpected for me in the very beginning, but that's what I found. And because you have people who don't have the actual principles behind them, they ended up getting more and more watered down over time, because if you don't hold the principles closely, then why would you essentially take the beating for actually, upholding those principles? I don't see why you would. And so it just turns out that if you're more conservative and more Christian in our modern culture, you'll take more of a beating than if you're on the other side. And so for that reason, people over time tend to move to the left, even if they basically are middle of the road with very few principles other than, lower taxes, for example, which is how I basically sum up modern conservatism at this point.
Right. It puzzles. Obviously, I'm not doing this for the money or the glamour or the really great parking lot in Buffalo winters. So I'm certainly not doing it for that. I'm doing what I'm doing because I want Christ to be known and loved, and in your own work, which is not as obviously Christ specific as mine, you're being motivated by Christian values and a Christian spirit. So it's kind of inevitable that there's going to be some kind of hostility and some kind of resistance. And I always said, I'm a soldier. I expected to be shot at from the front. It's being shot at from the back that is disappointing to me. Let's shift a little bit. As I said, I'm a melancholic Irishman. I struggle a lot with discouragement. The why bother is anybody listening? Who the hell cares? I'm knocking myself out. Is it doing anybody any good? Have those thoughts ever crossed your mind about your own work?
Oh, all the time. It's hard to fight when it seems like very few people care about the moral foundation. Like, I spend a lot of time talking about politics, but I don't actually care about politics in the sense that I don't care about Republican versus Democrat. The whole reason that I'm doing this is because I care more about the Christian values and the cultural conversations that we have and the way that it's affecting our kids and so on. And so there's a lot of overlap between that and politics. But it seems like so few people now talk about the moral underpinnings, and for that itself is kind of discouraging. But then I look at the hypocrisy that we see in modern culture. You see, part of the problem for me is that what is immoral is being held as moral and vice versa. Right. And so that's something that I like to point out a lot. Like, okay, we're talking about cancel culture on this segment, but what about the people who should have been canceled, if anybody should, but haven't? What about when the flaming homosexual YouTube star James Charles was exposed for his unlawful communications with minors, and he wasn't cancelled? In fact, even the companies that supported him still support him, still sponsor him. He's still on YouTube, despite sending pictures of himself that were indecent to minors, something that he admits, although he claims that he wasn't sure they were minors because, now he's got a lawyer involved. But Nothing happened for that. How about Drake Bell? He's the actor from the famous Drake and Josh TV show. He's now an adult and was recently charged with something very similar for his communications with minors. And again, no cancelling there either. No massive Me Too movement in that case. It seems awfully specific that the people who are cancelled, who are silenced, who are in a very real sense unpersoned, who have their bank accounts cancelled, who have their credit card processing cancelled, all of those people are those who are Christian and conservative. But those who are involved in something as heinous as pedophilia and who are public figures are still getting sponsorships.
Well, yeah, it confuses me. There seems to be kind of a selective indignation. Yes. And, it doesn't take a tremendous amount of insight to say, hey, some people are hypocrites. Wow. When did that start? There should have been. Isn't there an app to let me know? Isn't there like the hypocrisy app to let me know? I mean, there seems to be an app for everything, and Siri is trying to take over my phone again, even though I've never engaged. So we seem to be watched all the time, and we seem to be monitored all the time. And I've also found, and I really do believe, there is a tremendous, tremendous hunger for really basic truths. For Christianity 101, good versus evil 101, fundamental, this is a conscience, this is how you use it, that the hunger is there. The people know that there's something wrong. They know that they're being lied to. They know that their children deserve better than what's being offered to them, but they don't know where to turn. And they don't know where to start. So one of the reasons I get out of bed in the morning, and I'm not a morning person, believe me, is because there really are people who really aren't going to have much of anything. There's not a lot of people taking the time to teach them properly, and that's why I continue to do what I do. Going forward, I think we're gonna it's gonna be uphill and an unlevel playing field for a long time. Do you think that's how it's going to be going forward? That we're always our job will continually to be to fight outnumbered and win, or do you see any prospect in a reasonable amount of time for some kind of reconquista, for some big victory that's going to be a turning of the tide?
I think we have a long way to go, and in order for us to have that victory, I think you're going to have a lot more people who are frustrated enough that they're willing to risk in order to speak out. And I do think we have a long road of those of us doing so, and doing so with some degree of persecution. But I think it's worth it. And I do see an increase in people who are willing to speak out over time. And I do think it's kind of almost a silver lining, you might say, on this whole COVID saga, that people are beginning, albeit a lot slower than I would hope, beginning to see that maybe there are some limits that maybe the government shouldn't be able to impose. Maybe our rights actually mean something. And so there are some people for whom I think it's actually been helpful, although not for most. There's a battle going on. There really is. And it starts with people realizing that there is a battle, and that in order to fight, you have to actually, in the very least, speak.
Right. The idea of I just want to be left alone, I don't think that if it ever was an option, it's certainly not an option now. People don't. The powers and principalities will not leave you alone. They will monitor you. They will monitor your children, and they will propagandize you and your children. And we need to be equipped. We need that lie detector and truth detector as well. Can you talk a little bit for the listeners about what forms your principles? How confident are you in your moral compass before you go to the microphone?
I'm as confident as I can possibly be. I try really hard. My principles are founded in Christian ones, and most people who are publicly conservative, I don't think about it much. They say conservative, but they're not really thinking about what it is that they're conserving. For me, it's pretty clear that I'm trying to conserve traditional values, and those traditional values were those from when the West was Christian, right? So that's what I'm trying to impose, and that's the society that I think would be a lot better for us to live in. I think it's the society that we'd want to live in, and so that's what I try to do. And before I, as you said, get in front of the mic, I also try to understand the position of those who are on the other side to the degree that I can explain essentially where they went wrong, because they did go wrong in some area. I do find, though, that the response from those on the other side tends to be a almost religious-like sense of indignation, that I've told them there's something about their belief structure that's wrong, which is interesting because, I'm talking about not necessarily, Christian morality itself, but instead the manifest result thereof. So I'm talking in terms of something more tangible. So you would think that you wouldn't have such a kind of belief-based argument in opposition, but you do, and it's for that reason that the retorts are more personal. It's not you're wrong because of X, Y, and Z. It's I hate you. You're a bad person.
Right. I think, unfortunately, we tend to personalize everything. I remember when I was studying theology in London, we had a course on ecclesiology, and I was making a presentation, and I had a quote from Walker Percy, and someone asked me, says, after all these years, why are you still Catholic? And Walker Percy said, well, what else is there? Well, after class, Sister admonished me, said, well, Hans is from Germany, and he's a Lutheran, and how do you think that made him feel? I said, I don't know, because he didn't tell me, but I think if he was interested in just knowing the truth and evaluating my truth claim, he would be just fine. And Sister didn't seem to think that was adequate. I do believe that, if God gives you an opportunity to speak the truth, then you have to. If you refuse to be salt and light as our Lord commanded, then people are going to be led and fed from other sources, from worse sources, and that they can't possibly end well for us. Sarah, can you give us a bit of a hint as to what your next videos are going to be? Do you have some topics in mind that you're researching?
Yeah, at least one topic that I hope to put out this week. I've been struggling with pneumonia, and so my voice is in and out still, but is actually on the topic of the different homosexual battles that have been ignored. For example, there was a very famous case of a young boy who was raped by two homosexuals that I intend to draw light to. And around the same time of that case, there was another one where a drug dealer had been murdered, and he was homosexual. And that latter case is the one that got all of the news because it was declared to be a homosexual crime. It was a crime because he was homosexual. That wasn't actually the case, but the media attention to it was different. And I think that it's important that people realize the way that the media narratives are written in order to control our emotions and in an extended way control our laws. In that latter case, it was used as a justification to pass hate crime laws. So I do think that people need to pay attention to the way that our language is going and to the way that the media controls them by controlling the information that they get access to. I think that people in general think that the media that they see, it has a bias, but they do at least see the news. They see what's happening. It's just, written in a slightly leftist way or a slightly secular way, but it's not that. It's much more involved than that. Instead, they're being omitted from a massive array of news and then given only the news that would cause them to feel a certain way in order to change the culture. And by changing the culture, you change the laws and you change the politics, and it all goes downstream from that.
Right. Sarah, I am in agreement with you that we are dealing with very, very great powers of influence, and we need discernment, and we need defense, and we also need community as well as prayer. Sarah, thank you for being a heroically generous guest, and thank you for being the premier guest on our extended version of Timely Tuesdays. I hope we can do this again soon.
Thank you, too. It's been an honor. I'm
Jesuit Father Robert McTighe. Join us tomorrow. We're going to have a repeat podcast with Mary Carmichael called Homeschool Flip House, How to Turn a House into a Home and a Home into a Homeschool. Something to be thinking about as you've ended your academic year. You want to stay with us in the next segment? It's you and me sharing timely thoughts, reflecting on what we've heard today. After the broadcast today, go to thestationofthecross.com, get our resources list, download our audio as podcast. Be part of the conversation and follow what we're following by following us on Gab. That's gab.com. Our channel is called The Catholic Current. Check it out.
Hi, this is Joe McLean, host of the Catholic Drive Time Morning Show, joining you on the Station of the Cross Catholic Radio Network each weekday morning at 7 a.m. We'll keep you informed and inspired with insightful guests and breaking news stories of the day. That's the Catholic Drive Time, weekday morning, 7 a.m. on the Station of the Cross and the iCatholic radio app. We'll see you then. Praise be to Jesus.
After today's broadcast, go to the Catholic Current show page on thestationofthecross.com for info on today's guests, the show resource links, and to sign up for our weekly email of upcoming shows.
Praise be Jesus Christ. This is Father Robert McTigg of the Society of Jesus, your daily host for the Catholic Current, where we bring Christ to the world and the world to Christ. You're listening to us from the Station of the Cross Studios, your local radio station, and the iCatholic Radio mobile app, where we proclaim the fullness of truth with clarity and charity. It's a very special, timely Tuesday here at the Catholic Current. We began with Sarah Corriher, also known as the Crusader Gal, one of my favorite guests on the show, and we had a lively conversation talking about various aspects regarding confronting the cancel culture. And now it's just you and me here at the Catholic Current to talk about timely thoughts that we heard today. Two important announcements. Number one is, if you're listening to this on podcast, you should know that we have an extended segment where Sarah and I continue the conversation without commercial break. And if you're listening to this on a broadcast, you definitely want to go to the podcast to hear the rest of the conversation that I've had with Sarah. Also, we're making 15 copies of my book, Real Philosophy for Real People, available. Just email us at info@thestationofthecross.com to get an autographed copy. Let's take a look at some headlines that have been very much concerning me. The U.S. Senate votes against legislation that would ban creation of human-animal hybrid embryos. I can't imagine why they would do that. The governor of Nevada has decriminalized purposely giving someone HIV. I find that curious. I don't quite understand that. I've recorded a talk that's going to be available on a conference June 24th to 26th, sponsored by Michael Hitchborn, our friend at the Lepanto Institute, addressing the question, are we living in the time of the great apostasy? I'll be speaking about higher education, and apparently some people who haven't heard any of the talks are discouraging people from listening to the conference because apparently the idea of the topic of the conference offends them for some reason. My suggestion, listen to yourself and then decide for yourself. In talking about the cancel culture, one of the things that concerns me greatly is an inclination towards self-censorship. That there are some things that we may be thinking that we may hold to be true and dear and beautiful and right and good, but we dare not say because it will upset or offend someone or lead to an argument. And there's a place for politeness and prudence and circumspection. But after a while, that self-censorship becomes a kind of self-erasing. You know, Alexander Solzhenitsyn talked about the culture of the permanent lie, and he said, they're lying. We know that they're lying. They know that we know that they're lying, and they continue to lie, and we continue to pretend to believe them. That's not good for us. That's absolutely not good for us when we have to remain silent about what it means, what we know to be true. We dare not be silent about what is obvious. 2 + 2 = 4, not only in mathematics, but also in the realm of theology. Bonus points to my listeners who catch my reference there. If you're not sure if you're a man or a woman, look down. It really is that simple. Love your kids. Don't let them be exposed to very, very harmful, toxic ideas like not knowing whether or not they're a boy or a girl. A lot of common sense, and also revelation. God has inscribed his wisdom into the human soul and human flesh. And he founded his church, one church, to be the bride of his Christ. And that is the model for all marriage, for all fruitful marriage. We used to know that and consider it to be so obvious that we didn't have to say very much about it. Well, for a lot of people, it's not so obvious anymore. It seems to be up for grabs. So we need to re-immerse ourselves in common sense, in natural law, and in sacred revelation, sacred scripture and sacred tradition, so we can clarify for ourselves what our Lord has defined as true and good, beautiful and ugly, good and evil, so that we can explain it to others. Because if we fail to be salt and light, then something else is going to happen. I think back to a few years ago, there was some international feminist conference regarding abortion. and they decided to attack a cathedral. And they were stopped at the door by a group of young men who locked arms and barred their entrance to the cathedral, while the women were screaming, "Abortion is sacred, the church is garbage." There was a similar scenario in Spain right around the same time. A bishop was assaulted getting out of his car outside of a cathedral one evening. He's going in for an evening service. And as people rushed to that poor elderly man's rescue, a lovely young woman stood in the doorway and intoned the Salve Regina. In that tragic, dark, ugly moment, she was salt and light. But the people assaulting him, the bishop in Spain, the people trying to desecrate the cathedral in Argentina, most of them were native Argentinians. They were native Spaniards, which means they were almost certainly baptized, probably went to confession at least once, probably received the Holy Eucharist at least once. Many of them were confirmed. That's true, they're responsible for their own decisions. Yet somewhere along the way, someone, or likely very many someones for a long time, refused to be salt and light for them, or simply failed to be salt and light for them, which opened the door to the possibility of them attacking bishops and cathedrals. And that's just wrong. Let me shift gears a bit. My brother-in-law talks about outrage is contagious, and outrage is an addictive substance. And in contrast to, and there is a place for outrage, but then there is a place and a need for serenity. So I'm going to link to an article from New Oxford Review, which came out a few days ago, written by James Henning. James, if you're listening, I apologize if I mispronounce your name, and I do want to talk to you about this very fine article called Outrage and Serenity. Let me read to you his opening paragraph. He says, "From time to time, I've told people that outrage is the proper response to the outrageous. After all, ignoring the outrageous would be an outrage, wouldn't it? And it's outrageous that we so often ignore the outrages of the day." He goes on to say, "Sounds plausible, at least it did to me, but I got it wrong." And then he goes on to explain what he got wrong. But listen to his concluding remarks. He says, how should we respond to the outrageous? Well, he recommends serenity. He said, should we respond to the outrageous in a spirit of serenity? Well, okay, but what does Christian serenity mean? And this is key. He says, for the Christian, serenity does not refer to a feeling or mood. Serenity is not placidity, nor is it an eerie stillness. A smiling Buddha, perhaps, on the way to the dissolution of self, is not an icon of serenity. And this is how he explains Christian serenity. He says, serenity, rather, is the hard-won fruit of trust in God. When at Christ's bidding we step forth on the water to join him, we do so with serenity. When our faith fails and we sink into the water, our serenity leaves us. Friends, we are called to be serene. Serene in that sense, as he said, serenity is the hard-won fruit of trust in God. Our crucified and risen Lord, he who overcame the worst that sin and death can offer, he who promises to come back to judge the living and the dead and the world by fire, even now Christ reigns. Even now Christ reigns. And we have to claim his promises that he will not abandon us and that he is always faithful. Remember from the Gospel of John, chapter 16, verse 33, our Lord says, in the world you shall have distress, but have confidence. I have overcome the world. Friends, remember, we really do fight for the winning side. We do fight for a victorious king who doesn't need our help, but affords us the dignity of fighting faithfully at his side, so we that might enter into his joy and have a share in his glory. Do not lose heart. Do not be afraid. Fight today. Fight tomorrow. Call upon Christ and care for each other, body and soul. I'm Jesuit Father Robert McTighe here at the Catholic Current, your host every day at 5 p.m. Eastern at the stationofthecross.com and the iCatholic Radio mobile app. Join me tomorrow. We're going to have a return appearance of Mary Carmichael. She hosts Homeschool Flip House. She's going to talk about how to turn a house into a home and a home into a homeschool. Something to think about as this school year ends. Through the intercession of St. Ignatius Loyola and Our Lady of Mount Carmel, may Almighty God bless you, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Go in peace, and please pray for me.
Thank you for listening to this podcast brought to you by the stationofthecross.com, a listener-funded nonprofit organization. If this podcast has helped you in your spiritual journey, please prayerfully consider donating at thestationofthecross.com by calling 1-877-888-6279 or through our free iCatholic Radio mobile app.